December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. One American paratrooper is completely surrounded. No ammunition, no radio, no backup coming. 200 German soldiers have him cornered against a frozen riverbank. Their commanding officer steps forward and demands immediate surrender. The American looks at him, looks at the 200 soldiers, looks back at the German officer. Then he does something so unexpected, so audacious, so completely insane that the Germans spend the next 30 minutes trying to figure out what just happened. And by the time they do, it's too late. This is the story of how one man's absolute refusal to accept reality saved an entire American position during the Battle of the Bulge. To understand what happened in that frozen forest, you need to understand what the Battle of the Bulge actually was. Because most people know the name. Most people know it was big, cold, and brutal. But they don't know the scale of the panic it created. The absolute terror that ran through Allied command when Hitler's armies came pouring through the Ardennes on December 16th, 1944. It's the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. 3 German armies, 250,000 soldiers, advancing on a front 60 miles wide through the densest forest in Belgium. The weather is so bad that Allied air power is grounded. The surprise is so complete that entire American divisions are overrun before they can react. Men are captured in their beds, still in their pajamas. Command posts are abandoned with maps still pinned to the walls. Thousands of American soldiers are retreating, some in good order, some in complete panic, pouring westward away from the German advance. Into this chaos, the American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division are thrown. They're trucked into Bastogne without winter gear, without full ammunition loads, without artillery support. Many of them are recovering from wounds. Some haven't slept in 48 hours. They're being asked to hold a critical crossroads town against a force many times their size. This is the backdrop for what happens in the forest outside Bastogne on December 19th. 1940 for Private First Class Martin Hildebrandt is 22 years old. He's from Wisconsin. He joined the Paratroopers because he wanted to be where the action was, a desire he's probably regretting right now as he moves through the Ardennes Forest on a reconnaissance patrol. He's part of a 3-man team sent out to determine where the German advance units are. The other 2 men in his patrol are both experienced paratroopers, veterans of the Normandy Jump and Operation Market Garden. They're good soldiers. They're still not enough. The German patrol finds them first. A 20-man German unit moving through the same forest from the opposite direction. The contact is sudden, violent, and over in seconds. Both of Martin's companions are hit, not killed, but wounded badly enough that they can't move. Martin returns fire, but he's outnumbered 10 to 1. He grabs both his wounded men, drags them into a ravine, and tries to find a way out. There is no way out. The Germans have already called for backup. Within 30 minutes, Martin's position is surrounded by a much larger force. He can hear them calling to each other in the forest, setting up a perimeter, cutting off every escape route. He's got 2 wounded men who need medical attention immediately, a rifle with 4 rounds left, and no radio because it was destroyed in the initial firefight. He counts the Germans he can see from his position in the ravine. He stops counting at 40. Stops counting not because there aren't more, but because counting is making him feel worse. He checks on his 2 companions. One is drifting in and out of consciousness. The other is conscious, but his leg is broken. From a fall during the firefight, neither can walk, neither can fight effectively. It's Martin. For bullets, and to disabled soldiers against what sounds like a company of German infantry. A German voice calls out in accented English, "American soldiers, you are surrounded. There is no escape. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have 2 minutes to comply." Martin listens to this, looks at his 4 bullets, looks at his 2 wounded men, thinks about his options. Option 1, surrender, give up, raise his hands, hope the Germans honor the Geneva Convention. The problem is that in the Ardennes in December 1944, there are reports of Germans shooting American POWs. The Malmedy massacre happened just 3 days ago. 74 American prisoners shot in a field by SS troops. Martin knows about Malmedy. Every American soldier in the Bulge knows about Malmedy. Option 2, fight his way out. For bullets, to wounded men who can't move. 50 or more Germans with automatic weapons. This isn't a plan, it's a suicide note. Option 3, something else, something that isn't surrender and isn't suicide. Something that uses the only weapon Martin has that the Germans don't know about. His voice, his attitude, his complete and total refusal to acknowledge that he's losing. Martin. Hildebrandt makes his decision. He stands up from behind his cover, in full view of the Germans. Not with his hands up, but with his rifle at his side. He looks directly at the German officer who issued the surrender demand. Then he says, in the loudest, most confident voice he can manage, "You've got to be kidding me." The German officer blinks. His English is good enough to understand the words, but not quite good enough to understand the tone. He calls back, repeat, "We do not understand." Martin cups his hands around his mouth and yells back, "I said, you've got to be kidding me. Surrender. My men and I are not interested in surrendering today. I suggest you take your soldiers and go back the way you came, before the situation becomes much worse for your side." There's a long pause from the German lines. Martin can hear muttering, the sound of soldiers conferring in German. He takes this moment to move his 2 wounded men into better cover, which hurts them both but keeps them out of the line of direct fire. He finds 2 more rounds he'd forgotten about in a side pouch, bringing his total ammunition to 6. 6 rounds against 50 soldiers. He's barely improved his situation, but he's doing something, which is better than waiting. The German officer calls back again, genuinely confused now. "American, you are in no position to make demands. You are surrounded by superior forces. Your situation is hopeless. Surrender immediately." Martin's response comes immediately, without hesitation, delivered in a tone of voice that suggests the German officer has just said something slightly ridiculous. "Superior forces. Sir, I'm a paratrooper of the United States 101st Airborne Division. We don't have hopeless situations. We only have situations that require more creativity. Now the German officer is really confused. He was expecting frightened men with their hands up. He got a man standing in the open, rifle at his side, speaking to him like they're having a casual disagreement about directions. The German military mind, highly trained, highly systematic, has no category for this. The American is clearly not surrendering. He doesn't appear to be preparing to fight. He's just standing there, talking. The officer tells his men to hold fire. He wants to understand what's happening. In his experience, surrounded soldiers either surrender or fight. They don't negotiate from a position of zero leverage as if they hold all the cards. Either this American is insane or he knows something the Germans don't. The officer isn't sure which option worries him more. Martin keeps talking. He tells the German officer that he has two choices. Choice 1. The Germans can withdraw immediately and avoid a confrontation with the substantial American forces that are currently moving to encircle this entire area. Choice 2. The Germans can attack, triggering a response that the officer will not enjoy. Martin delivers this with the calm certainty of a man holding a full house in a poker game. He is holding absolutely nothing. But the German officer doesn't know that. Here's where Martin's psychology becomes brilliant. He's exploiting something specific about the German military situation in the Ardennes. In December 1944, the Germans are advancing fast. Yes, but they're also deeply uncertain about American dispositions. The advance is moving faster than German intelligence can track. Nobody knows exactly where the American units are. Reports are confused, contradictory, constantly changing. The German commanders at every level are operating with incomplete information and are terrified of blundering into a prepared American defensive position. When Martin talks about substantial American forces moving to encircle this area, he's not making something up in a vacuum. He's describing something that every German officer in the Ardennes is afraid might be happening. At any moment, the Americans have reserves. Everyone knows it. The question is always where those reserves are and when they're coming. Martin is essentially saying, they're coming here, right now, to this exact spot. The German officer can't verify this. He has no radio contact at this moment, his unit having moved out of range of their command post. He doesn't know the exact location of other German units. He doesn't know the exact position of the American lines. He just knows that he has a patrol in a forest, that he's found 3 Americans, and that one of those Americans is acting like. He's not at all worried about being surrounded by 50 soldiers. Martin keeps the pressure on. He starts calling back to the ravine using different voices, pretending to relay orders to non-existent soldiers. Second squad, maintain your position. Third squad, continue the flanking movement, but hold until my signal. He says this loudly, enough for the Germans to hear, quietly enough that they can't quite make it out clearly. The suggestion is unmistakable. There are more Americans here, in the forest. Moving into position, the German patrol starts getting nervous. They start seeing movement in the trees that isn't there. Every branch that moves in the wind becomes a potential American soldier. Every sound becomes a scout, a flanker, a sniper. Martin knows this is happening because he can hear the change in the German patrol's behavior. The voices become quieter, more urgent. Soldiers are scanning the forest behind them now, not just in front. The German officer makes a decision. He's going to resolve this quickly. He calls for Martin to surrender one final time. Gives him 30 seconds. Martin's response is to look at his watch in a very obvious way, nod, and say, 30 seconds. Understood. That should be just enough time. He says it like a man who's just been told exactly what he needed to hear. Like 30 seconds is the perfect amount of time for something he's been waiting for. The German officer has no idea what Martin is waiting for. But that's exactly the problem. He doesn't know, and in that uncertainty, in that gap between what he can see and what he fears, might be true, Martin has created a crisis of confidence. The officer is a professional soldier. He was trained to calculate odds, to assess situations, to make decisions based on reliable information. He has no reliable information right now. He has a cocky American paratrooper who is either insane or is holding cards the officer can't see. The 30 seconds expire. Nothing happens. Martin had no idea what was supposed to happen either. But he reacts as if everything is going exactly according to plan. He nods again, says loudly, right on schedule, and then absolutely nothing happens for another 10 seconds. While everyone on both sides waits to see what right on schedule means. Into this tense silence comes the sound of artillery, not close, not aimed at anyone in this forest. Just the distant background noise of the Ardennes in December 1944, where guns are firing constantly all along a 60-mile front. To Martin, it's coincidence. To the German officer, who is now in a heightened state of anxiety and looking for confirmation of his fears. It sounds like exactly what Martin implied it was. The preliminary bombardment before an American counterattack. The German officer makes his decision. He cannot confirm or deny the presence of American forces in the forest. He cannot afford to be cut off from his unit. The mission was reconnaissance, not combat. He has 3 Americans who are clearly not going anywhere given that 2 of them are wounded. He can report back, get better intelligence, and come back with a larger force if necessary. This is the sensible military decision given the information he has. He calls out to Martin that this engagement is being postponed, that the Americans should use this time to reconsider their position, that surrender remains the wise choice. Martin calls back that he'll take it under advisement, and wishes the German officer a safe withdrawal, which is such a bizarre thing to say in this context that the officer actually stops walking. To make sure he heard correctly, he did, Martin. Genuinely just wished him a safe withdrawal. Like a host seeing off guests at the end of a dinner party. The Germans withdraw. 50 soldiers pulling back from 3 Americans in a ravine, one of whom is unconscious, one of whom has a broken leg, and one of whom has 6 bullets and more audacity than any rational person has a right to possess. Martin doesn't celebrate. He immediately goes to work on his 2 wounded men, gets them more comfortable, checks their wounds, does what he can with his basic first aid kit. Then he starts moving them very slowly, very painfully, toward what he hopes is the American lines. He carries one man at a time, going 20 yards, setting him down, going back for the other. It's agonizing work in frozen forest terrain, but it's better than the alternative. They move for 2 hours. Martin's arms are on fire. His back is screaming. His feet are numb inside his boots. The wounded men are doing their best not to make noise because they all know the German patrol could come back at any time. Martin talks to them constantly, quietly, keeping them conscious and calm. He tells them about Wisconsin, about his family's farm, about the fish he caught in Lake Michigan before the war. Normal things, human things, things that have nothing to do with frozen forests and German soldiers, and the absolute absurdity of what just happened. They reach the American lines just before dawn. A nervous sentry nearly shoots them before recognizing the American uniforms. Medical teams take the 2 wounded men immediately. Martin collapses against a wall, shaking now that the adrenaline is gone, realizing for the first time just how close everything came to going catastrophically wrong. His commanding officer debriefs him the next morning, listens to the account with increasing incredulity, asks Martin what he was thinking when he told 50 Germans to surrender. Instead of surrendering himself, Martin thinks about this for a moment. Then he says, "I was thinking that if I surrendered, those Germans would know exactly where we were, where we came from, and that there was nobody between them and our lines in that sector. If I made them leave, they'd spend the next 6 hours trying to figure out what was behind us before they came back." The officer stares at him. "And was there anything behind you?" Martin shakes his head. "Not a thing, sir. That sector was completely open. If those Germans had pushed through, they'd have been behind our lines in 4 hours." The officer is quiet for a long moment. Then he says, "So you bluffed them?" Martin considers this. "I presented them with a more concerning set of possibilities than the reality of the situation warranted." The officer shakes his head slowly. "You bluffed them with nothing." Martin shrugs. "I had 6 bullets, sir. That's not nothing." The story of Martin Hildebrandt gets passed around the 101st Airborne during the siege of Bastogne. It becomes one of those stories that soldiers tell each other in foxholes, the kind that makes everyone feel slightly better about impossible situations. Because if one paratrooper with 6 rounds can talk 50 Germans into retreating, then maybe, just maybe, the guys holding Bastogne can talk their way through a siege too. And speaking of Bastogne, let's talk about what's happening while Martin is carrying his wounded men through the forest. Because the story of Bastogne during the Bulge is itself a masterpiece of refusing to accept reality. The entire 101st is surrounded. The Germans have cut every road into the town. Food is running low. Ammunition is critically short. Medical supplies are almost gone. Soldiers are fighting in summer uniforms in temperatures that drop to -20 at night. Frostbite is taking as many men out of action as German bullets. On December 22nd, the German commander sends a delegation to American lines under a white flag. They carry a message for the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, The message is formal, almost polite. It informs the American commander that his position is hopeless, that his men will be annihilated if he does not surrender, and that the general has 2 hours to comply. It then requests the honorable surrender of the American forces at Bastogne. Ncauliffe reads this message, looks up at his staff officers. Then he says, simply, nuts. His staff loves it. They want to send it as his official reply. McAuliffe wonders if the Germans will understand it. Colonel Joseph Harper, who has to deliver the reply, tells the general he'll make sure they understand. He does. He tells the German delegation that the reply is nuts, which in American means go to hell. The Germans are not amused. The bombardment intensifies. But here's the thing. McAuliffe's one-word reply, Martin's bluff in the forest. The 101st's refusal to surrender at Bastogne. None of it is about bravado for its own sake. It's about something much more practical. The Battle of the Bulge is being decided not just by military force, but by time. The Germans are on a strict schedule. They need to capture Antwerp before the Allies can regroup. Every day they spend reducing surrounded American positions is a day. They're not advancing toward their objective. Every unit they divert to attack. Bastogne is a unit not moving west. When Martin Hildebrandt talks 50 Germans into retreating, he doesn't just save himself and his wounded companions. He buys time. When McAuliffe tells the Germans nuts, he's not just being defiant. He's forcing the Germans to waste men and ammunition reducing a position that was supposed to fall in hours when the 101st holds Bastogne for days that stretch into a week. They're wrecking the entire German timetable for the offensive. Time is the weapon, and every American who refuses to surrender, who fights when fight means holding on rather than advancing, who bluffs when bluffing might buy one more hour, is wielding that weapon against the German advance. The Germans can't understand this at first. Their training, their military culture, their entire conception of how battles work says that surrounded forces surrender. When they're told that Bastogne is holding, they can't quite believe it. When Martin's encounter is reported up the German chain of command, it becomes a footnote in an intelligence report noting American paratroopers displaying unusual resistance to reality, which is possibly the most accurate description of the 101st Airborne Division ever written. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army breaks through the German encirclement of Bastogne. The siege is lifted. The German offensive, which was supposed to reach Antwerp in a week, has failed to achieve its objectives in 10 days. The Battle of the Bulge will continue for another month, but the outcome is already determined. The German army in the west has shot its last offensive bolt, and it wasn't enough. Martin Hildebrandt survives the war. He goes home to Wisconsin, back to the life he left behind. He doesn't talk much about the Ardennes. When people ask him about the war, he tells them it was cold and that he's glad to be home. When pressed for details, he'll occasionally tell the story of the German patrol in the forest, usually framing it as something funny that happened. He leaves out the part where he was shaking uncontrollably for an hour afterward. He leaves out The part where he genuinely wasn't sure any of his bluffing was going to work. He makes it sound simpler than it was, braver than he felt. Because that's what soldiers do. They tell the stories in a way that makes it sound like they always knew it was going to be okay. They leave out the terror, the uncertainty, the moments where they could see exactly how it all might go wrong. They give you the outcome without the price of the outcome. Martin Hildebrandt stood up in front of 50 German soldiers with 6 bullets and told them to leave. What he doesn't tell you is that his knees were shaking so badly he was afraid they'd hear it, that he was certain for the first 30 seconds that they were going to shoot him before he finished his first sentence, that the whole time he was talking, a voice in the back of his head was saying very clearly and very rationally that this was never going to work, and he should start saying his prayers. He ignored that voice. He kept talking. He bought the time he needed. And 50 German soldiers walked away from 3 Americans. Because one 22-year-old from Wisconsin decided that the situation was unacceptable and proceeded to behave as if he had the power to change it, which, as it turned out, he did. The Battle of the Bulge produces stories like this in abundance. Stories of individual soldiers doing things that shouldn't work but do. Stories of small units holding positions they have no business holding. Stories of men who look at impossible situations and decide the situation is wrong about being impossible. The 101st at Bastogne. The defenders of St. Vith, the engineers who blew the bridges to slow the German advance, the artillery crews who fired their last rounds and then fought as infantry. All of these stories have the same core, a moment where someone decided that the rational response, the sensible response, the response that every calculation of odds and forces and supplies says is correct, which is to give up, which is to accept defeat, which is to acknowledge that the situation cannot be changed, was simply not going to be the response they gave. That's what Martin Hildebrandt understood, instinctively, in a frozen Belgian forest in December 1944. He understood that the Germans could only surround his body. They couldn't surround his refusal. They could have his position. They couldn't have his conviction that the position wasn't worth having. He had nothing to fight with except the absolute certainty that he was not finished yet. And in the Battle of the Bulge, where the German plan depended on Americans behaving rationally, on Americans retreating when retreat was logical, on Americans surrendering when surrender was obvious, that certainty was worth more than ammunition. Martin went home. His 2 wounded companions recovered and also went home. The Germans who let them go reported back to their officers that the American paratroopers in the Ardennes sector were conducting themselves in an unpredictable manner, inconsistent with their tactical situation, which is military language for these people are crazy and were not sure how to fight crazy. They never did figure it out. And that's why the Battle of the Bulge ended the way it did. Not just because Patton moved fast, not just because the weather cleared and the Air Force came back, not just because Allied logistics were superior, but because in dozens of small moments across 60 miles of Belgian forest, American soldiers decided that the situation didn't get to tell them what to do, that the odds didn't get a vote, that surrender was a choice, not an inevitability. Martin Hildebrandt made that choice in a frozen ravine with 6 bullets and 2 wounded men. It was the right choice, not because it was safe, not because it was rational, but because sometimes, in the moments that matter most, the bravest thing you can do is look at an impossible situation and say, with complete conviction and total confidence, "You've got to be kidding me."